On the morning of July the 19th, 2014, James Garner was found dead in his home in Brentwood, California. He was 86 years old. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. He had died of a heart attack, alone, in the house in Garner where he had lived for decades, in the neighborhood of Los Angeles where he had built the quiet, private version of his life that the public version of James Garner had always been designed to protect. The death was reported with the warmth that the entertainment press extends to beloved figures who have lived long and well. The tributes mentioned Maverick and the Rockford Files and the films that had made him one of the most consistently watchable presences in American television and cinema for 5 decades. They mentioned his humor and his charm and the specific quality of relaxed, anti-heroic masculinity that he had brought to every role he played. The quality that made him seem, in every scene he occupied, like the most intelligent person in the room who had also decided that being the most intelligent person in the room was not something worth advertising. They mentioned the stroke he had suffered in 2008. They mentioned the heart bypass surgery that had preceded the stroke in 2007. They mentioned that he had been in diminishing health for several years, and that his death, while a loss, was not a surprise to the people who had been watching him closely. What they did not mention, because the family had not made it available for mention, and because the specific nature of what James Garner had been through in the years between the bypass surgery and his death on that July morning, was information that the family had understood to be private and had kept private with the quiet, steady insistence that characterized everything about the way James Garner had always managed his relationship between the public world and the interior one, was the full extent of what those years had contained. His daughter, Gigi Garner, spoke, in the years after his death, with a careful obliqueness that honored both the truth of what the family had experienced and the privacy that her father had always required. She said that the final years had been hard. She said that the health difficulties had been more extensive than the public account suggested. She said that her father had faced things in those years that he had not wanted the public to know about, and that the family had respected that wish, and that respecting the wish had not made the knowing of the things any easier to carry. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you the whole story. Not only the story of the hospital and the years that the family carried what they carried quietly, but the full story of who James Garner was, where he came from, what he built, what it cost him to build it, and what the 86 years of his life contained beyond the charm and the roles and the specific quality of apparently effortless ease that had been the most durable public fact about him since the first episode of Maverick aired in September of 1957. Because the ease was not effortless. It never is. The ease that the public received from James Garner for 5 decades was the product of a life that began in Oklahoma in 1928 under conditions that were as far from ease as conditions can be. And that required from the boy who was born into them a quality of adaptation and self-management, and the specific, hard-won capacity to present a functional surface to the world regardless of what the interior was doing. That was forged in experiences that the public version of James Garner was specifically designed not to call attention to. So, come with me. We are going back to Norman, Oklahoma, in the year 1928, to a family that was not intact in the ways that families need to be intact to provide what children need from them, and to a boy who would spend his entire life finding ways to manage the consequences of what the early years produced. James Scott Bumgarner was born on the 7th of April, 1928, in Norman, Oklahoma. He was the third of 3 sons born to Weldon Warren Bumgarner and Mildred Scott Bumgarner. The family was not wealthy. Norman, in 1928, was a small university town on the plains of central Oklahoma, and the families that lived in it in the years around the Depression were families organized primarily around the question of whether enough money could be produced to meet the week's requirements, and secondarily around everything else. Mildred Scott Bumgarner died when James was 4 years old. He was 4 years old, and his mother died, and the death left a specific hole in the structure of the family that the subsequent years filled imperfectly, and in ways that left marks. His father remarried. The woman Weldon Bumgarner married is described in James Garner's memoir, published in 2011 and written with the journalist John Winokur, in terms that are the terms of a man who has spent 80 years managing his relationship to a painful early experience and who has decided, late in his life, to describe that experience with more directness than he had previously permitted himself. He describes his stepmother as a woman who was cruel to her stepchildren in the specific, persistent way that cruelty of that kind operates. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have produced a single incident to point to, but systematically, in the daily accumulation of small degradations that are each individually deniable, and that collectively constitute an experience that the children subject to it never fully recover from. He has said, in the memoir and in interviews, that he was physically abused by his stepmother. He has said this without drama and without the performance of injury, in the specific manner of a man who has processed something over 80 years and is now able to state it as a fact rather than perform it as a wound. It happened. It shaped him. It produced in him a quality of self-protective vigilance that would remain a permanent feature of his interior landscape regardless of what the subsequent decades built around it. His father was not absent, but his father was not sufficient. Weldon Bumgarner was a man who provided in the material sense and who was not able to intervene in the domestic situation in the ways that the children needed him to intervene, either because he did not see what was happening or because he did not have the capacity to act on what he saw. Which of those was the case is not something the available accounts resolve with certainty. What is certain is that the children were in the house with the stepmother, and that James, the youngest, was in that house during the years of maximum vulnerability, and that what the house produced in him was not what a house is supposed to produce in a child, which is the sense that the world is safe and that the people responsible for your safety can be relied upon. He left home as soon as leaving was possible. This is the biographical fact that all subsequent facts depend on, because the leaving was not a choice in the ordinary sense, but a necessity in the specific sense of a young man who has understood that the alternative to leaving is remaining in a situation that is damaging him. He left at 14, 15. Different accounts give different ages because the leaving was gradual rather than sudden, a slow drift away from a home that had not been a home in the necessary sense, toward whatever was available in the world outside it. He drifted. He worked whatever jobs were available to a teenage boy in Oklahoma in the early and mid-1940s. Gas stations, oil fields, the kind of a physical outdoor work that the Depression and its aftermath made available to young men who needed money and who were willing to do what was required. He was not aimless in the way of someone who has no direction. He was aimless in the way of someone who has not yet found the direction, who is moving away from something rather than toward something, and who is trusting that the something toward which he should be moving will eventually become visible. He was drafted into the United States Army in 1950. The Korean War was underway. He served in the 7th Infantry Division and was deployed to Korea, where he participated in combat operations that were more intense than the official record of his service tends to describe. Because James Garner, across 60 years of interviews and one memoir, was not a man who talked about Korea beyond the minimum that the questions required. He said he was there. He said it was bad. He did not elaborate in the way that would have made the badness available to the public for consumption, because the badness was his and he was not offering it. He was wounded. He received the Purple Heart twice. The specific nature of the wounds and the circumstances in which they were received are not described in the public record in any detail, because he did not describe them in any detail, and because the military records of the Korean War do not have the accessibility of later conflict records. He was shot, at least once. He was wounded in a way that left physical consequences that were still present 40 years later, when the body began to document the accumulation of its history in the specific way that bodies document history in middle and old age. He came back from Korea. He had no clear direction still. He was 25 years old and he had been shot at, and he had survived, and he had the specific quality of orientation that combat produces in the people who survive it, which is a very clear understanding of the difference between what matters and what does not matter, combined with a very unclear understanding of what to do with that understanding in the ordinary civilian world that continues its ordinary civilian business, regardless of what the veteran has been through. He fell into acting accidentally, as he fell into most things in those years. A friend was in an acting class. He went along. The acting class was taught by Peyton Price, a serious teacher. And what happened in Price's class was what happened to Burt Reynolds in acting class. What happened to many of the people we have talked about across these months, which was that the performing of other people provided access to an interior life that the rest of the person's existence did not easily permit. James Garner, in an acting class in Los Angeles in 1954, found that he was good at something. The goodness was not immediately apparent to everyone, but it was apparent to people with eyes for it, and the people with eyes for it began to offer him work. He appeared in a Broadway production, briefly. He appeared in television, which was the medium that was expanding fast enough in the mid-1950s to absorb the supply of young men with presence and trainable professional skill. He changed his name. James Bumgarner became James Garner, taking his mother's maiden name, in the specific act of nominal self-reinvention that marks many people who are in the process of constructing a professional identity that is separate from the identity that the family of origin produced. The name change was more than a professional decision, though it was also a professional decision. It was the claiming of the one parent whose presence in his life had not been damaging, his mother, whom he had lost at 4, whose last name he was now taking as his own. It was a way of carrying her with him and of separating himself, in whatever small way was available to him, from the stepmother and the stepmother's name and the stepmother's house and everything the house had contained. Maverick premiered in September of 1957. He was 29 years old, and the role of Brett Maverick, the cowardly, witty, perpetually self-interested frontier gambler who outsmarts rather than outfights, who talks his way out of situations that other Western heroes shoot their way out of, who is openly and consistently more interested in money and survival than in the codes of honor that the Western genre typically required of its protagonists, was the role that became James Garner's public persona, in a way that the roles of most actors do not quite become their public persona. It became his persona because it was not entirely a performance. The qualities that made Brett Maverick work on screen were qualities that James Garner actually possessed: the intelligence, the wit, the specific quality of anti-heroic self-awareness, the willingness to puncture the pretensions of the heroic mode rather than inhabit them earnestly. He was good at playing Brett Maverick because he was, in substantial measure, Brett Maverick, or the closest thing to Brett Maverick that a man from Norman, Oklahoma, who had been through what he had been through, could be in 1957. The show ran for 4 seasons. He left it in 1960 after a dispute with Warner Brothers over the working conditions and the compensation that the studio was offering its contract players. A dispute that was significant because it was one of the earliest and most visible instances of an actor leaving a successful television series on the grounds of contractual unfairness rather than declining ratings. He left because he believed the studio was treating him unfairly. He was right. He left without the certainty of what came next. The films came next. The Great Escape in 1963, in which he played Flight Lieutenant Robert Hendley opposite Steve McQueen and Richard Attenborough, and a cast that represented the apex of what international ensemble cinema could assemble in the early 1960s. The role required from him the specific quality of relaxed, competent intelligence that Brett Maverick had established as his professional signature, and he gave it to the camera with the ease of a man who has found the thing he is best at and who no longer needs to work very hard to produce it. He was good in The Great Escape in the way that he was good in almost everything. Consistently, reliably, with a quality of presence that made the scenes he was in feel more grounded than the scenes he was not in. He was not the lead. He did not need to be the lead. He had understood something about the specific contribution that a supporting presence of his quality made to an ensemble, that the reliability and the ease and the specific quality of intelligence he brought to a role were things that made other performances better, that gave the people acting with him something solid to push against, and that this contribution was its own form of excellence, even if it was not the form that Oscar campaigns were built around. The Academy Award nominations went to other people. They went to people who were doing the kind of acting that the Academy recognized as the kind of acting worth awarding, which in the early 1960s was the kind of acting that made visible effort visible, that showed the work, that demonstrated the preparation, that gave the audience the satisfaction of witnessing a performance rather than being unaware that a performance was occurring. James Garner's acting was the opposite of that kind of acting. You were not aware, watching him, that he was acting at all. You were simply aware that the person on screen was someone you wanted to keep watching, without being entirely sure why. Not being entirely sure why is a description of one of the most difficult things in acting to produce, and the fact that it was not recognized as difficult, that it was received as ease rather than achievement, was one of the most consistent injustices of his career. The Rockford Files began in 1974 and ran until 1980, and the 6 seasons of that show represent the sustained summit of his television work and one of the sustained summits of American television drama in the 1970s. Jim Rockford, the private investigator who lives in a mobile home on the Malibu beach, who charges $200 a day plus expenses, who is perpetually in debt and perpetually being beaten up, and who responds to being perpetually in debt and perpetually beaten up with the specific quality of resigned, intelligent pragmatism of a man who has accepted that the world is not going to reward his efforts with the outcomes they deserve, is the character that most completely and most honestly expressed who James Garner actually was. Rockford was the Oklahoma boy who had been through what he had been through. Rockford was the Korean War veteran. Rockford was the man who had built a professional life and a public face on top of a foundation that the public did not know about and was not going to be told about. Rockford was the man who met the world with wit and competence and an underlying quality of weariness that the wit and competence were designed to manage and contain. He won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actor in a drama series for The Rockford Files in 1977. It was the recognition that the work deserved and that had been longer in arriving than it should have been. He received it with the ease that was his characteristic public response to recognition. Gracious, warm, briefly self-deprecating, and quickly redirected away from himself and toward the other people who had contributed to the work. The injuries were accumulating by the mid-1970s. This is the medical story that runs underneath the career story, and that the career story, with its emphasis on the performances and the roles and the professional achievements, does not fully account for. He had been injured in Korea. He had been in car accidents. The physical demands of the Rockford Files, which he performed largely without a stunt double because he was capable of doing the work himself, and because he found the use of a stunt double professionally unsatisfying, produced over 6 years a series of additional injuries that were not individually catastrophic and that collectively represented a significant accumulation of physical damage to a body that was already carrying the consequences of what Korea had done to it. His knees were damaged. His back was damaged. The knee injuries were severe enough that by the late 1970s, he was in chronic pain that was affecting his daily functioning, and the management of the chronic pain involved the medications that were available for the management of chronic pain in the late 1970s, which is to say that the management involved painkillers and that the painkillers were not managed with the oversight that the subsequent decades would make standard. He became dependent on painkillers. He has said this himself in the memoir, with the same directness with which he said the other difficult things. As a fact, without drama, without the performance of struggle that the recovery narrative typically requires. He was dependent. He recognized the dependence. He addressed it. He managed it. The managing of it was not a single event, but a continuous process that the subsequent decades required him to maintain. And the maintaining of it was something the family knew about and that the public did not. He left the Rockford Files in 1980. The official reason given was health, which was accurate as far as it went. He was in physical pain that was severe enough to make the demands of the show impossible to meet. The knee injuries were at the point where continuing at the pace the show required was not something the body could sustain. He left. The show ended. He had given it 6 years, and those 6 years had given the body what the body had received as a consequence. The bypass surgery came in 1988. He was 60 years old. The surgery was successful in the sense that he recovered and continued to work and lived for another 26 years following it. It was not without consequence in the sense that a bypass surgery at 60 on a body that had been carrying the accumulated physical history of Korea and the car accidents and the stunt work and the chronic pain and the medication is not without consequence, regardless of how well the immediate surgical outcome presents. The 1990s were the decade of the second significant health crisis, which overlapped with the career transition that brought him the kinds of roles that aging actors receive when the industry has moved past their moment of maximum commercial utility, but recognizes that they retain something worth using. Television movies, supporting roles in theatrical films. The specific category of work that the industry assigns to actors who are no longer box office, but who remain genuinely excellent at what they do. He did the work with the same professionalism he had always brought to it, and the work was often good, and the recognition that it received was often less than it deserved. Space Cowboys in 2000, directed by Clint Eastwood, in which he played one of 4 retired astronauts recruited to repair a Soviet satellite. He was 72 years old in the film, and he was extraordinary in it, in the specific way of actors in their late careers who have arrived at a quality of inhabited authority that cannot be produced before the years have done their work. The film was not a great film, but he was excellent in it, in the way that he had always been excellent, quietly, without advertisement, in a manner that made the excellence feel like the ordinary output of a man who simply occupied his work with the completeness that the work required. The stroke came in 2008. He was 80 years old. The stroke affected his mobility and his speech in ways that required rehabilitation, and that, by the family's account in the years following it, were more extensive in their immediate effects than the public reports suggested. He had, by 2008, a family that had been managing his medical reality for some years with the specific combination of love and practical competence that medical realities require from the people around the person experiencing them, and the stroke added a dimension to what they were managing that the previous health challenges had not contained. His daughter, Gigi, was, by multiple accounts from the people who knew the family, the person most centrally involved in the management of his care in the years between the stroke and his death in 2014. She was his daughter in the full sense, not only biologically, but practically, in the daily, grinding, unglamorous sense of being the person who makes the medical appointments and talks to the doctors and ensures that the prescriptions are filled and manages the household and coordinates the care, and does all of this while also being a person with her own life and her own needs and the specific quality of depletion that caregiving produces in the people who do it, without the infrastructure that wealth is supposed to provide. But that wealth does not always actually provide in the way that theory suggests it should. He had not been wealthy in the consistent way that would have made the care easier. The career had produced money over 50 years, and the money had been managed in the way that the money of creative professionals is often managed, which is to say imperfectly, in the sense that the periods of significant income and the periods of significantly reduced income had not always been balanced against each other with the prudence that long-term financial planning requires, and that the accumulation of savings that should have been available in the final decade was not as substantial as the career would have suggested it should be. This is not a dramatic story of financial ruin. It is the quieter and more common story of a man who spent 60 years working in an industry that is inherently economically unstable, who managed the instability as well as most people manage it, which is to say not entirely well, and who arrived in his 80s with the specific combination of diminished income and increased medical need that is one of the most difficult combinations the late stage of a life can produce. He continued to work in the final decade. He did television guest appearances. He appeared in commercials. He accepted the parts that were offered, which were not always the parts that his abilities deserved, and he gave them what they required with the professionalism that had never left him regardless of what the circumstances were requiring. The family knew the full extent of what the years between the bypass and the stroke and the final morning had contained. They knew because they had been there, not as observers, not as visitors, but as the people who had been in the house and in the hospital and in the conversations with the doctors and in the daily reality of what the care of an aging man with a complicated medical history actually required. They knew, and they kept what they knew with the specific, loyal privacy of people who understand that the person they are caring for has a claim on the management of his own story, and who intend to honor that claim regardless of what honoring it costs them. What it cost Gigi, specifically, is something she has spoken about with the oblique honesty of a woman who is choosing her words carefully because the words are describing real things, and real things require care in the describing. She has said the years were hard. She has said that her father's final years were not what the public account of them suggested. She has said that she carries the knowledge of what those years contained in a way that is simply part of who she is now, and that she does not expect that to change. He died on a Saturday morning in July, alone in the house in Brentwood. The coroner determined that he had died of a heart attack. He was found in the house, not in a hospital, not surrounded by family, which is a detail that the obituaries noted briefly, and that means whatever it means to the people reading it, which will be different things for different people. He had been found alone in a house before, across the 86 years of his life. The boy in Oklahoma had been alone in ways that the adult had spent 60 years constructing a professional persona to not advertise. The veteran had come back from Korea alone in the sense of carrying something that he was not going to ask anyone else to carry with him. The man in the mobile home, not the fictional one, but the actual one. The man who played the fictional one so well because he understood from the inside what the fictional one was, had always had a quality of fundamental aloneness that the warmth and the wit and the ease had been, from the beginning, designed to make manageable. He died in the house. He died in July. He was 86 years old, and the body that had carried chorea and the stunt injuries and the bypass and the stroke and the chronic pain of 60 years of physical work finally stopped the carrying. And the family, which had been there for the years when the stopping was becoming inevitable, received the news and kept carrying, as families do, the weight of what they knew that the public did not know and was not going to be told. I want to sit with you for a moment now, my friend, in the quiet that this story requires, because James Garner is a story of a particular kind that I want to be specific about. He was not primarily a story of secrets, though he kept things private that the public would have found significant. He was not primarily a story of institutional damage, though the entertainment industry did not always treat him with the recognition that his work deserved. He was not primarily a story of grief, though the losses were real and were carried in the way he carried everything, which was without public advertisement. He was primarily a story about adaptation, about a boy from Norman, Oklahoma, who had been damaged by the specific circumstances of his early years in ways that the professional career he built was designed, in part, to manage. About a man who took the specific qualities that the damage had produced, the vigilance, the self-protective distance, the capacity to read a room and understand what was required without making the reading visible, and turned them into the thing that made him extraordinary at his work. About a person who gave the public, for 50 years, the ease that was the polished surface of everything his life had required him to process and contain. The ease was real. That is important to say. It was not a performance in the sense of being manufactured from nothing. It was real ease, genuinely felt, genuinely expressed, but it was also the product of a life's work. The ease was what remained when everything else had been organized and managed and processed sufficiently that it no longer disrupted the surface. The surface was genuine. What it was genuine on top of was not easy. His family knew what was underneath. They had been in the rooms where the surface was not the thing being managed, where the thing being managed was the full accumulation of what the 86 years had produced and required. And they had managed it with him and for him, and alongside him in the specific way of families who understand that love is not a feeling but a practice, and who practice it in the ordinary, unglamorous, daily way that the practice requires. They kept what they knew. They are keeping it still. They have the right to keep it, and I am not suggesting otherwise. What I am suggesting is that what they kept is the fuller version of the story of a remarkable man, and that the public version, for all its accuracy about the roles and the charm and the ease and the Emmy Award and the Rockford Files, is not the whole of it. He was from Norman, Oklahoma, and his mother died when he was 4, and his stepmother was cruel to him, and he left home as soon as leaving was possible, and he went to Korea and was wounded twice and came back without making a production of what Korea had been, and he became James Garner in the acting class and the television show and the films, and he gave the public the ease for 50 years, and the family knew what the ease was built on. That is the whole story, or as close to the whole story as we can get from the outside. The rest is theirs. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see Jim Rockford answer his phone in the opening credits, hear the message from the caller he doesn't want to hear from, and put the phone back down with the specific expression of a man who knows that whatever the message is, he is going to have to deal with it, and who has already, before the episode begins, made his peace with that. See what is in the expression. You are looking at a man who had been making his peace with things since he was 4 years old. He got very good at it. He made it look easy. That was the whole point.